Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and we are back with the Science of Fallout series where we are talking about FEV-2 and the Master. So, following on, we talked about the virus and kind of how it works and what it does to rewrite the DNA of living things that are exposed to it. So, the kind of first generation of super mutants that were created by the Master is an interesting kind of part of this. So the important thing is that there was a specific strain of FEV that was used at Mariposa military base in California. So after the testing at West Tech progressed far enough, the scientist that was in charge there wasn't happy about the idea of using it for human testing, so they decided to move it to the Mariposa military base, and he wasn't happy about that, but that's what they did, and they continued to experiment using human test subjects there. So much later, after the bombs fell and everything, we do know that a group of people made their way to Mariposa military base and found their way inside. We've talked about Harold before, who became a ghoul that had a tree grown out of his head and then eventually became more tree than anything else. But the other man that went on that excursion that we're interested in is Richard Gray. So what happened when they were dealing with aggressive robots at the military base, and Richard fell into a vat of FEV and experienced a prolonged exposure, so he was in there for quite some time, so he had a massive dose of the virus, and that obviously caused mutations because that's what FEV does. So his mental capacity massively increased, and he began experimenting and testing and planning his philosophy and his plans for the future of humanity, which is what would go on to become the Unity. So he perfected the process and he began churning out super mutants, sending them off out into the wasteland to collect more humans. Specifically, he was interested in people that had not yet been exposed to any form of FEV before and with minimal radiation exposure, because they apparently mutated the best, and that means that he was looking for vault dwellers. So, what was the goal for the Unity? The Unity was to create a new society of people who were physically superior to humans and better equipped to live in the radiated wasteland, so resistant to disease, resistant to radiation, and tougher to deal with all the mutated creatures and things. So the Unity would be free of pettiness, hatred and jealousy and all the stuff that led to the war happening. A perfect utopia free of all the problems of humanity, with the Master at the helm. And these super mutants, most of them actually retained their intellect from before they were dipped. Some of them actually increased in intelligence, the Master being the most dramatic, but it did happen for a few others. There were a few that lost some points in their intelligence stat as well. But the idea would be that everyone would be equal under this new regime. Those who refused to be transformed could live out their lives, but they weren't allowed to breed and reproduce. Yet, the Master intended to basically force as many people as possible to join his army of super mutants. He believed this was the key to peace. One race, all with the same goal. Everyone's equal, happy and safe, and it's the next logical step in human evolution. However, even among the Master's army of mutants, some of them were considered more superior than others. The Nightkin were his elite, utterly perfect versions of the super mutants. Those who lost intelligence were treated as the rank and file, and not as important as the Nightkin, strong, but needing the guidance of a superior intellect to function in their role within the Unity. So, interesting kind of thing there, like everyone's equal, but some are more equal than others. Wonder where we've heard that before. So what was the problem with this? Because we know that the Brotherhood were investigating and other people were talking about these strange mutants that were killing people and attacking people in the wasteland. And the first thing really is that forcing this kind of thing on someone isn't a good thing. Making someone go through a painful process like this without their consent, ethically, it's not great, let's face it. But who cares about that, right? Not the Master, not Vault Tech, not the Enclave. Ethics, consent, morality, out the window. Nobody cares, which is a problem. But the biggest problem was that the Unity was dead end. While we know that the super mutants have much longer lifespans than humans, but they're not indestructible, and they could potentially die of aging eventually. But either way, because they can be killed by something eventually, they're going to die out if they can't reproduce. And they can't. They're sterile, so according to the autopsy report, the gonads are present and everything else works as it should. But the issue is with the gametes, particularly the ova, the eggs. So those who have the female anatomy, they retain that anatomy, but the egg cells are damaged. So let's talk about the reproduction and how these cells are produced. So the gametes, as hopefully you know, is the eggs, the ova are the spermatozoa, the sperm, and obviously sperm meets egg, and that's conception, fertilisation, and then eventually a baby. In theory anyway. And apparently the sperm production side of things is fine in the super mutants, but they're produced on a daily basis by the million essentially, so they're continually being produced. But the eggs are different. So a person is born with a finite number of oocytes, which are the cells that mature into ova or eggs, and that is the number that they'll ever have. They won't make more, so if they run out, that's it. And that's kind of what menopause is that they're running out. So that's why the cycle kind of stops at that stage of life for the majority of women. So each one basically matures into a follicle that contains the egg cell, and that is what's released during ovulation, which in humans happens roughly once a month, every 4 weeks, give or take. There's a bit of variation, which is natural. And the important thing about these gametes is the DNA. So typical cells have 46 chromosomes, which is 23 pairs, including one pair of the sex chromosomes, which can be XX, XY. Sometimes nature likes to throw in a wee bit of variation in there, because that's how biology works. It's never that simple, but typical, that's the arrangement of chromosomes. So there's 23 pairs. But gametes are what's called haploid cells, which means that they only have one of each of the chromosomes. So instead of a pair of chromosome 1 and chromosome 2, etc., they have one chromosome 1, one chromosome 2, and so on and so forth. So the idea is then that we combine at fertilisation to create a full set with half inherited from the mother, half inherited from the father. That's how that process works. But because the oocytes are already pre-existing in the body, FEV, its function is to correct DNA. So when it finds that the oocytes are missing half of their chromosomes, it basically rewrites it to correct it, which means that these cells then have double the amount of chromosomes they're supposed to have, and that blocks fertilisation from happening, so there's no way for the reproduction to take place. They can't breed. So if the master was to succeed and convert every single living human on Earth into a mutant and not allow any humans to breed, then there's an expiry date on the unity. Eventually, all the mutants are going to die from some reason, and there's nothing to replace them. So that's something, and this is something that becomes important later on, especially if you don't want to actually fight the final boss of the game. So we need to talk about FEV-2, because this is the strain that the master was using for creating his super mutant army. So it was a new strain that he modified and adjusted through experimentation to suit his purposes. So he created this FEV-2, and the human subjects were submerged in the vat for 24 hours because that was the optimum dose for complete transformation. So that's what he did, and they were done in batches, usually about half a dozen at a time, and hopefully most of them come out the way the master wants them to. If you visit Headscribe Vree at the Brotherhood, she has autopsied a mutant, and the mutant weighed in at 363.21 kilograms, which is 799 pounds, and 77% of this was muscle mass, 10% was bone mass, and the rest was fat and tissue and organs and stuff. And she noted that the skin was tougher, but the healing is kind of impaired. So this first generation of super mutants, they retained their intelligence and they were much more kind of reasonable, still a bit prone to aggression and easy to kind of piss off, but far better organised and capable of discussion and reason and all that kind of thing. But there was a second generation of FEV-2 super mutants that were created that lost a lot of their intelligence, and they were created, it was actually accidental. So the Enclave took a group of kidnapped slaves to Mariposa because they presumably wanted them to dig out the rubble because they wanted to get samples of the FEV from the military base. But the slaves were exposed to the FEV-2 and became these less intelligent super mutants, which were unfortunately labelled dum-dums by some of the first generation mutants, like we see with Tabitha in Fallout New Vegas. So that's what she refers to them as, because the Nightkin were always held up as being the superior version of the super mutants. So Tabitha kind of mentions that. Then there's another kind of experiment that's somewhat related, and that is the Psychers. So this was a separate experiment that the Master did with FEV to create these people that had psychic abilities that had the potential to do a lot of damage. Apparently they could have wiped out the human race, and they ended up wearing nullifiers to kind of suppress their abilities and try and protect their sanity, with limited success. If you speak to them, they're definitely, kind of losing their marbles a little bit, which is interesting. And this obviously brings us into kind of supernatural territory more than scientific territory, but it's not the first time we've seen mutations lead to powerful psychic abilities. We can ask Patrick Stewart about that as an example. So how did this happen? The method that was used was to inject the FEV directly into the brains of the subject. So instead of dipping them in the liquid, they put it straight into the brain and certain areas of the brain. So the main target was the pineal gland, which is where melatonin is produced. So this gland regulates your sleep and your circadian rhythm. So when you're sleepy, when you're awake, and how that works on your kind of 24-hour basis. The other targets that they used was the amygdala, which is part of the brain that controls memory, decision making and emotional responses as well. And then finally the medulla, which is the part that controls all the automatic parts of the body, so your autonomic nervous system, which affects your kind of heart rate, all that kind of thing, your blood pressure, respiration, and also contains the vomiting centre, which is less fun. But all the important things that keep the body alive. So these were the areas that were targeted with this FEV. And this caused, there was a lot of failures with that, but there were, you do find 4 people under the cathedral in the LA Vault who have these psychic abilities and things. So it has had some success, and it is something that the Master himself has, is that he has some potent psychic abilities. So if you're planning to fight him, it is recommended that you get one of the nullifiers from these psychers in some fashion, because that can help you to defend yourself against his psychic attacks. And it does also seem to have happened to others kind of spontaneously, which in scientific terms means kind of happening randomly for no specific reason. And it just kind of happens out of the blue. So there's the kid that you can talk to at the 188 trading post, the forecaster, and Mama Murphy in Fallout 4, although she needs a wee bit of chemical help in order to have her visions. But the forecaster in Fallout New Vegas, he has the ability to kind of see the future and see the kind of fate of people around the place, and he also wears one of these nullifiers, which he has to take off. He calls it his medicine. He has to take it off to use his psychic abilities. So very, very interesting. Interesting one there, and again, the psychic abilities might be a next step in human evolution. We have seen that in sci-fi before as well. It's an interesting one. Okay, so why did the Unity fail? And the ending for the Master really does depend on your approach to that last kind of boss encounter. So you can fight him just like your typical final boss battle, big dramatic fight, and you eventually take the bad guy down and everything's great. You can do the sneaky route, which means that you can sneak in and set off the nuclear bomb that he has without him knowing that you were there. Or you do have the option of talking him round, but you need to do a bit of work beforehand in order to be able to do so. So you need to get the holotape from Headscribe Vree at the Brotherhood that proves that the Unity is a dead end because the mutants are sterile. Unsurprisingly, the Master's reluctant to accept this truth and is very distressed by the news. So he decides that everything that he's done has all been in vain, and I guess feels guilty about potential suffering that he caused. So he chooses to destroy himself and the entire cathedral, so he then basically sets off his nuclear bomb and gives you a generous 4 minutes to flee for your life. But whatever option you go with, the outcome's the same. The LA Vault, the cathedral go boom, and the surviving mutants are kind of scattered to the wind to find their own path. And this proof of sterility is very important, because even if the Vault Dweller didn't come along and do anything, the entire thing was doomed. Any species that can't reproduce in any way is doomed to eventual extinction. And the Master didn't know this, which I think was a real oversight on his part. It was quite bold of him to assume that the FEV-2 strain wouldn't affect fertility, and it's possible that maybe he only looked at the male side of the equation and just assumed that it would apply to the female side of physiology, and it didn't. So it's something that he definitely seemed to have overlooked, and just kind of assumed that it would be fine, and his mutants could have baby mutants and it would be great, and he's very upset when you can prove that that's not the case. And I think it does highlight the risks of forcing evolution. You see what I did there? But it's true, the evolution in the real world happens over millions of years and thousands of generations. Mutations that are advantageous to the species are more likely to survive and then be passed on, while those that are detrimental to survival are less likely to be passed on to offspring. It's not something that happens overnight or in a single generation, unless you do force the issue by rewriting and editing the genome of a species, which obviously can work, but can have unforeseen circumstances and consequences. And that's why the Master and his Unity was always doomed to fail. So this is how the FEV-2 worked and the impact that it had on the wasteland. Other places had different strains of FEV and they produced results that on the surface seem to be the same thing, but they are actually quite different, such as the Vault 87 mutants in the Capital Wasteland. So we're off to DC next week to look at these mutants and see how they compare to the Master's army and what the differences are between the two variants, because they are very, very different in a lot of ways. And I think it's quite interesting to kind of highlight that and contrast and compare. So hopefully you'll come back for that. As always, I love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I did post a bit of a nonsense video yesterday with some of the fun random encounters from Fallout 1 while I was getting a save file up to the end and to get the footage for this video. I had a lot of fun with that, and also the surprise that if you take the bloody mess trait at the very end when the Overseer tells you to leave and not come back, your character just shoots him in the back and kills him. So I had no idea that was a thing. I'd never seen it before, so it's a shame I didn't have the mic on when that happened to catch my initial reaction to it, because I was just like, what the hell just happened? It happened so quick as well. I'm like, wait, what? What? I don't remember this. Anyway, so there's a little fun aside, and that video's up. I put that up yesterday. I say just silly wee funny things and some of the fun random encounters, because I'll live for all that kind of stuff. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye.